So you guys have probably heard at the Times about how we have this brand new, like still has the new car smell on it, wonderful, smart, fantastic audience development team that's done all these great things in the last few months that they've existed. That is not me. Sorry to disappoint all of you who came here for that. Like Joy said, what I do is I'm one of the deputy editors on the interactive news desk at the Times, which is a slightly different thing. And the takeaway from what we do is going to be slightly different from what the broader Times is doing around a lot of this sort of thing. But I thought it's on a fire alarm.
We have an Amber alert in Missouri.
Oh. But hopefully we're going to make this useful to you anyway. Ostensibly what I'm going to be talking about a little bit is some of the ways that we sort of uniquely apply sort of very fine-grained metrics and measurements in the course of doing our particular kind of work. But depending on how worked up I get during the course of this may also become like my treatise on generalization and having developers with editorial skills involved in your newsroom, as well as just having developers in general around. And so what in the heck is interactive news? You might know us from our greatest hits. Every couple of years, there's this big expensive popularity contest that gets run all across our country. And we tend to work along with our graphics and design desks on things like the elections, the big tentpole events, also things like the Olympics every couple of years as well. We do some things that kind of walk the line between product development and standard editorial stuff. We actually built the platform that the Upshot runs on when that launched last year. We've also done some stories for the Upshot, so that these things that kind of span the gamut there. We build tools for the newsroom to produce all sorts of cool stuff. We've got a thing that allows you to build list-shaped articles now, which is aptly titled Listy. We have a watermarking tool, which I think Justin can probably, you might remember this, but in Neiman Lab, the 50 predictions for 2015 or whatever, someone predicted that someone was going to build a simple watermarking tool right about the time that we launched ours internally. So we do things like that. We also, from time to time, write stories, work with reporters. Basically, our team is a team of developers with journalism sensibilities that touch all of the things in the newsroom that developers in some way, shape, or another with journalism sensibilities could touch. And so, obviously, we span the gamut. Because I couldn't do this without a pyramid. And I inverted it, too, because we're journalists. The way that analytics applies to what we're doing is a little bit different than the Times is working with them writ large, I think. And it's because we are sort of this insulated team who works on the stuff that we work on, but we not only have these journalism sensibilities to be able to turn out this cool editorial stuff, we also control the means of production because we're developers, because we're technologists, because we actually build the things, right? And so because of that, we're able to just kind of on our own, we've been doing this for years, sort of assess how people are using the things that we build by building sort of these custom engagement metrics and looking at our audience in these very specific ways as they relate to the projects that we're working on, which is a little bit different from the rest of the way that the newsroom obviously looks at this stuff. And so if you think about the world of engagement metrics, at the very top, if you think of these things as abstractions, essentially, at the very top you have the valuable ones that can be applied site-wide. That's where the fame and the money live. That's where your attention minutes and your engagement minutes and these sorts of things live, to see how people are engaging with your content writ large. That's like where Johnny Manziel hangs out on the weekends. Down at the tip here, we have lots of different types of things that are much less abstract and much more concrete. Down there we're talking about things like clickstream data, being able to see how people actually interact with a very specific piece of content. On a live blog, how far down do they scroll? Do they click the drawer to open up more posts? These things that are very, very specific that have a lot to do with the specific type of content that you're producing. We live down there where the money is not. But we are watching you. And so the Times, as I'm sure a lot of other places do too, the Times has a very robust event tracking system built into basically everything that you read. It's called Event Tracker, also very aptly named. And basically every time you click on anything and any time that you interact with the site in very key ways, we learn about it, we know about it. We also know certain things about you based on your subscriber status and these other sorts of things that then in turn allow us to form profiles of how different types of users use different types of things on the site. Have no fear if you don't have the development resources at the Times at your disposal. Google Analytics does this just as well. And so there's all sorts, I'm sure Chartbeat and the other things, I've never really messed around with them in this context, but I'm sure they do the same. Event tracking is essentially our bread and butter on this team and the way that we see how people interact with stuff. We've learned a lot of interesting things doing this, and it really day-to-day sort of shapes the types of things that we build, the development decisions that we make, and we see a lot of great results from this in terms of how people come and interact with our things. Recently, we have decided to start trying to reinvent the live blog experience at the Times. The old platform that we used to live blog on, I mean, it was pretty old for one, and was in the need of an overhaul for a lot of different reasons. My boss has actually grown this huge Grizzly Adams beard. I don't know if he wants me to tell this story, but I will, because he promised his boss that he wouldn't shave it until live blogging was fixed. That is seriously true. So in the last few months, we actually started with the elections, and it's kind of evolved since then. We've reinvented our live blogging platform, spending a lot of time to pay attention to how people are actually interacting with the thing. And one thing that we've learned, for example, over the course of time is that people tend to come to our live blog in two different states. One is during the course of an event, obviously, which you would imagine people would come to a live blog for, to see the most recent updates as they come in. The second, and traffic-wise and engagement-wise and everything else, this tends to be just about as great as the first case that you'd expect. Second case they come back to is the next day, when they want to see the wrap-up, right? And so we know we have these two situations where people like to interact with our live content. And so knowing from watching clickstream data that all these things, we were able to engineer an experience that kind of optimizes for both of these things. One thing we know people don't do is if we have a more posts button at the bottom of our blog, say 20 posts deep, damn near nobody clicks on that. I mean, you've got to be really into this if you want to click on that button, and such a small percentage of our users click on that button that we know that people who come into the blog halfway through the night aren't actually seeing the previous context of what's gone on. So one thing that we did was we added a little summary post that goes to the top of all these things that the desks can keep filled out with the key highlights so people don't have to go scroll down and explore, because we know they won't anyway. We also have a new type of a roundup tool that we've created for the day after on these live blogs that we call conversation pieces, that essentially summarizes all of the key events of the night before in this very visually appealing way. And that's designed to capture the audience that comes, obviously, the next day. So we've sort of watched this and been able to engineer this in a way that works well for both of those. We've also done some really fun experiments around things like geo-targeting. This is from 2013, and since this is pre-redesign, somehow this looks so old to me, even though it's only like a couple of years old. But when New York was having its mayor's race, one thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to put New York City elections coverage in front of people who were coming from New York, because that's the people that it was the most relevant to. And so we created this huge obtrusive promo that had we actually put it on a regular homepage that everybody could see, probably would have made a lot of people a little bit upset. Instead, we've geo-targeted this so that it only appeared for people who came in from New York. And we found that by doing that, we saw a lot more than your standard click-through rates on a promo like that, which was, again, just an experiment we literally thought up and put together in a couple of hours. Because being our team, we have both the sort of the editorial sensibility to think about that, but also the ability to just create it without having to put it through any type of development workflow. This has subsequently been expanded into other geo-targeting experiments in the UK and some other places where we've tried to test different types of content on different audiences, oftentimes with mixed results. Another thing that we found out is that curated promos at the bottom of articles perform better than automated algorithmically generated ones. We did this, or we figured this out by creating a tool that allows you to put in curated promos to different types of articles, in this case at the bottom of an upshot piece, that allows you to curate them in very interesting and different ways. For example, we can set rules on some of these that if a user clicks through on one, it won't appear for them next time they come back. Little basic things that you would think would be good to have in something like this. And we've A/B tested this and messed around with it and have discovered that this, in fact, does perform reasonably well. And so we've created a tool that allows producers and others in the newsroom to be able to create these collections of things that we call Promotron, which is undergoing some renovations at the moment. One other thing that we knew, another experiment that we ran, was we had this big series last year on esports, which I frankly knew very little about until I read our series on esports. And one thing that we knew from looking at the way that people interacted with our other video game coverage and some lead-up coverage in the esports world was that the Reddit community was really into this, much more so than a lot of our other social networks would be. Our CMS does not support the addition of things like Reddit share buttons in our share tools natively. In fact, I'm pretty sure that if we were to tell them that they had to support that in some way that was actually within the confines of the CMS, We'd have to probably submit all these tickets and sit down for all these meetings and go back and forth and do this whole thing in one of their sprint cycles, none of which is a terrible thing, but it wasn't something that was fitting with our timeline, and so we just learned to hack it in ourselves. We just injected a little bit of code that puts a nice little Reddit share button over there. It performed very well in the course of this series. We used it for a bunch of other stuff. I'm really bad at NCAA brackets. This is actually mine. A couple of months ago, actually, it was probably about a month and a half ago, we started having conversations about what we were going to do around the NCAA tournament this year. We know that we're not ESPN or CBS. We know that people do not necessarily come to the Gray Lady when they want to compete in NCAA tournament brackets. We know this because the last time we did one was in 2011, and even though the number of people went and actually did it wasn't insignificant, it certainly wasn't that big. So this year, naturally, we brought it back. We actually discussed this a lot, whether this was a good thing for us to do and whether it was worth the investment. We decided a couple things that did make it worth the investment were, one, we're going to take a slightly different take on this. Basically, it's this market-based bracket. I don't know if you guys have seen this, where like the prices of different teams change based on who's picked the teams. It's very cool, actually. I highly recommend taking a look at it. So one was it was an excuse for us to kind of mess around with a different approach that was very upshotty. This kind of came as a collaboration through the Upshot and Sports Desk. The other, though, is it gave us a chance to understand the audience of people who actually does want our NCAA stuff, who actually would respond to a bracket. Now that we have the ability to track a lot of this stuff, we were able to then, in turn, sort of see who it was that was engaging with this. And so next year, when we have the same conversation again, we can make a much more informed decision as to what we're going to do. The spoiler alert is that this thing totally over-indexed for nerds in every way, shape, and form that we could possibly measure nerds. This thing way over-indexed for nerds. It did show us, though, that we have a small but dedicated audience of fans who would come back for something like this. The numbers are actually pretty comparable to 2011, give or take a little bit. And the Upshot sort of imprimatur on this thing also exposed it to an entirely different audience that has this kind of interesting sports overlap based on some of the other Upshot content that's been done. That is a market for this sort of thing that we can exploit if we decide to do it next time. I think one thing we probably won't do, if I had to guess, and obviously this isn't entirely my call, is just a conventional NCAA bracket. I think that by sort of understanding the audience around who wanted to use this, we know that just doing a regular old like CBS, ESPN style bracket is not our game. And so we'll make sure to play much closer to the audience that we have in the future. And again, this is all this data that we're gathering. It's boring, right? And it kind of is a lot of that. I mean, the most remarkable thing about the handful of little weird examples, like the total potpourri of examples that I was just walking through, is there's nothing especially remarkable about them at all. This is just sort of our daily way of doing business in a lot of ways. We see something that we want to know more about. We see an opportunity to engage a particular audience. It doesn't necessarily fit the mold of what our tools are currently allowing us to do. And so we make it ourselves, figure it out. And the reason that we're able to do that, I think, is because this very unique team structure that we have that puts people with journalism sensibilities and developer sensibilities in the same place, as opposed to sort of the other method where you almost treat developers now like you would the pressmen, you know, before all of this digital stuff came along, where it's like they live in some other building and you ship them some tickets and then they like feed them into the, you know, the machine, and then out comes the product on the other side. We, by being able to make both editorial decisions and create these things, are able to iterate, do these experiments much faster, make sure that the next thing that we build is always better than the last, because that communication gap and that process gap just simply doesn't exist. And I think that that speaks very highly to the need in this context for sort of people who are essentially, I hate the word, but I'll use it anyway, unicorns, who have these joint sensibilities, of which at least one of my former students was sitting in the back a minute ago, if you guys want to hire one of these folks. But of which, you know, there are not a tremendous number, but being able to bridge that culture gap and finding those people and bringing them in, I think really does pay dividends in the sense that it allows you to kind of control your own destiny in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. And that's something that we're very much trying to do at the Times, just in the context of our own team. And even now, like you probably, I don't know if this had made the rounds yet, but there was a public announcement earlier on that Kinsey Wilson, who came on to be sort of our chief digital person and innovation person on the newsroom side, was also going to take a lot of the business side digital stuff under his umbrella as well. I don't think I'm breaking that news. I'm almost positive that was on Pointer earlier. And this is sort of, even organizationally, it's sort of taking these two worlds and smashing them together in a way that allows for much more rapid iteration, experimentation, measurements in ways that you wouldn't otherwise be able to measure, and sort of an ability to not have to rely on these pre-baked, not just metrics, but processes and other sorts of things that a lot of us have to because those worlds are so separate. And so like I said, I was going to probably get on my high horse about this at some point. I complain about this a lot. But this also kind of gets, all the way back to the beginning of this, resisting this one-size-fits-all engagement metric, which was ostensibly what I was supposed to be talking about. The way that you do that, I think, and the way that we've done that, is by investing in the people to be able to try these more specific things and investing in a process that allows for that to happen. And so I've got 3 minutes and 53 seconds if anybody has any questions.
Questions? Gotta move fast.
Hi there. I'm just wondering if on your side of the room you talk about the print product at all?
What's that? Yeah, I mean, we definitely do. I think it's interesting in some ways because I think that some of so like my background, I was a reporter. I came up at this J school in the print sequence doing print-shaped things. A lot of people in our sort of corner of the room are the same way. I think that now a lot of what we talk about as it relates to the print product it's actually kind of funny. Like, now that you mention, we don't talk about it a lot, but when we do, it's usually about taking what it is that was designed initially for print, of which there are still a large number of things, and then taking the best elements of what made those valuable in print and translating them to digital in some way. And one example of this, we haven't decided whether or not we're going to do this exact. Actually, you know what? There was something from last year. It's almost the same. So we have this fall arts calendar that the Times puts out every year, which is this massive, massive, massive to-do that the Culture Desk puts together in print. I mean, the thing is like pages and pages and pages of all the things that all of the people who are more cultured than me would really like to do in New York at any given time during the course of the fall season. And the way that it's always been run in print is this just giant blob of text with some design elements thrown in. And the idea, I suppose, in the past used to be like, you save this thing as a resource, right? Like this is supposed to be a piece of reference material that you're going to retain that you can use throughout the course of the season to be able to tell what you should go through. Maybe you'll take some stuff and copy it onto your calendar or whatever. So we've tried to figure out that utility experience and translate that into digital in some ways. We're trying to retain that same experience, but like migrate it to digital. We'll be doing the same thing, I think, with the movies preview that the Culture Desk also does in the summer. Other question?
First question, will you share Listy with all of us, please, or license it? Second question, can you talk a little bit about the process for stopping doing things? Because we have this discussion a lot in my organization, which is great. We want to do all these other things. What are we going to stop doing? And how do you do that when people, it's like that thing just hasn't gotten enough traction, but if we keep putting a little more marketing, a little more resources in it, just curious how you make those decisions. That's
a super interesting question because that's a problem everywhere, right? I mean, we definitely have that problem in some cases, and like there's 1,000 reasons why one might have to continue to do something, right? It either could be that the right people in the organization are behind it for some reason, or that it's getting just enough traction but probably not enough. And like there's all these periods where you could sort of have that. We tend to look at things in phases a lot. And so, not to use the buzzwords, but MVPs and all these sorts of things, we try to put things out in front of people very quickly and then decide that the work on these long continuing projects is going to be blocked like that. And so essentially, we put the minimum thing out there, people actually like the minimum thing, we'll go to phase 2. If not, we'll put it on phase 3. We box all of it as best we can, rather than sort of trying to create these long-running, have to support it until the end of time style projects that I think that it's easy to fall into the trap of. We try to create these artificial boundaries around phases of the way we want to evolve something. And then after a certain point, there's always this spot at the end of one of these phases where we decide if we're going to reevaluate and if we're going to proceed to the next.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chase.